thank you for joining us. My name is Janine Coleman, and I'm the Executive Director of Origins Council. We're pleased to present the fourth webinar in our series for Legacy Cannabis Genetics, People and Their Plants, a community-driven study. This webinar will cover our research methodology, community-based participatory research, which is a pioneering type of research methodology. We're excited to share that with you all today. We are intending for today to be an interactive webinar, so we really would love to hear from you all. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. If you're feeling comfortable, share your name, location, your interest in California cannabis. I'll go over the agenda here shortly. We do ask that you please keep yourself on mute, and we'll open up for comments and questions and engagement at a few points during the webinar. So thank you all for joining us. And next slide, please. So just a little bit of information for you all. We want to highlight our website at legacygenetics.org. You'll find information there about our research team, previous and upcoming webinars, including recordings of our previous webinars, upcoming community events, educational materials, and as the study continues, we'll be posting our publications there. Please email us at info@legacygenetics.org with comments or questions. If you're interested in getting involved with the research or serving on our community advisory board, which we're going to talk about later today in the webinar, we'd encourage your engagement, so please feel free to reach out. Next slide, please. So about our workshop today, we're going to offer a brief overview of the study, and then my friend and colleague Marge is going to present on our research methodology, community-based participatory research. And then we'll go into cultural sensitivity and research and some of the work that we've done to address that in this project. Then we'll do an overview of the research tracks within the project. And then we'll talk about the application of community-based participatory research, excuse me, in our project. And then we'll move to participant feedback and engagement, and then close us out from there. So about the research project itself, in 2021, the California Department of Cannabis Control invited research proposals to document and preserve the history, value, and diversity of California's legacy cannabis varieties and cultivation practices. Our team came together, inclusive of academic researchers, scientists, and community-based organizations, to propose this multidisciplinary community-based participatory research study. In 2023, the Department of Cannabis Control awarded our team a $2.7 million grant to pursue this study, which will conclude in late 2026. Next slide, please. So a little bit of overview around the nomenclature and sort of the heart and soul of the research project. So what does legacy mean? This refers to traditional cultivation practices, traditional cultivation regions or communities, as well as legacy growers and legacy cultivation regions. So this is really the focus of our research, and harkens back to our research questions regarding what is legacy cannabis and what are legacy producing regions. So genetics refers to the inherited traits and characteristics of cannabis plants in this case, which are determined by their DNA. It includes how different cannabis varieties or cultivars pass down specific qualities, including growth patterns, pest resistance, flavor profiles, and active constituents like THC, CBD, terpenes, cannabinoids. And why do we care? To preserve the historic cannabis cultivation communities of California and their genetic resources, and to ensure the continued biodiversity and innovation of California cannabis. As many of you know, the historic cannabis cultivation communities are facing great existential challenges due to the circumstances surrounding legalization and market access. And so this research is more important than ever at this critical time for these communities. And the threat to biodiversity of California cannabis. Next slide, please. So a little bit of a summary around the project to identify, document, and help to preserve, again, the history, value, and diversity of California's rural legacy genetics and the communities that steward them, to incorporate public education and community-driven research, to implement the standard methods, excuse me, and systems used across agriculture to define, document, and legally protect individual and collective resources, genetic resources, to analyze the impacts of colonialization, as well as the impacts of existing and potential policy frameworks on legacy genetics, and finally, to produce a suite of policy recommendations. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So we wanted to introduce our team. So here we have our co-principal investigators, Dr. Dominic Corva, the Assistant Professor of Sociology and Program Leader of the Cannabis Studies major at California State Polytechnic University, Humboldt. Myself, Janine Coleman, Executive Director of Origins Council. Dr. Todd Holmes, historian with the Oral History Center at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. And Dr. Eleanor Kuntz, co-founder of Candor, the world's first cannabis herbarium, and co-founder and CEO of LeafWorks, a genomics and plant science company. Next slide, please. Thank you. And here we have our project personnel. That includes Marge Plum, consultant in community-based participatory research, Khalil Ferguson, president and CEO of United Core Alliance, Hannah Nelson, OC Research Education and Development Program Advisor, Sam De La Paz, Communications and Community Engagement Advisor, Ross Gordon, Research and Policy Analyst, and Richard Mendelson, Advisor on Appalachians Law and Policy. And with that, I'm happy to pass it to Marge. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here again. If you haven't chatted who you are and where you're coming from and your interest in this topic in the chat, please do so. We'd like to know who's here. I'm going to talk about the community-based participatory research part of the project. Next slide, Janine. So first is to kind of understand community-based participatory research, it's really helpful to understand how it relates to traditional research. There's a lot of things traditional research is really, really good at. And there are some challenges to traditional research. One of the things that happened in the late 1950s was the whole research structure kind of really developed around this idea of rules around how you conduct research, and in particular, research neutrality. There was a belief that if researchers were involved in the community that they were researching, that their research would be invalid, that they would lack credibility, and that primarily their research would be seen as biased. So the idea became that researchers needed to have a really separation from the people they were researching. Next slide. Some of the limitations of traditional research, and again, there are a lot of positive things that traditional research can do, but some of the limitations are that traditional research often treated communities as kind of passive subjects rather than active partners. Traditional research can feel extractive to community members as both the research and the skills leave with the researcher when they're done doing research on the community, and that can lead to feelings of not wanting to be engaged, feelings of feeling again researched on. The research that excludes community input can result in findings or interventions that are not relevant or practical for the community. If you don't really understand the community and what the community is experiencing and understanding, you maybe not going to understand what the results of your survey mean, correct? In that sense. Historical exploitation and marginalization in research has created mistrust. And so many vulnerable populations are often represented in studies because they fear continued exploitation and marginalization. And so a lot of research, can have a really hard time bringing people of color, bringing women, bringing LGBTQ people, bringing people who have been incarcerated into their studies, because those populations feel like if they participate, then harm is going to come to them. And then finally, traditional research often stops at publication. Researchers, hope that if they publish, that policymakers and community organizations running programs will read their article that was published in the academic literature and do something about it. But it often is not the case. CBPR, really helps to shift that. Next slide. So the structure of CBPR simply is that there is an equal partnership between community members and research scientists, and the partners work together on every step of the research. So identifying the research question, developing the research plan, carrying out the research, interpreting the results, and disseminating the results. Go ahead, next slide. I'm going to drill down on each of these areas in the next five slides. So identifying the research question, what the community does in that is they share their lived experiences, concerns, they participate in discussions, and they co-design the research question to ensure it reflects the values, goals, and cultural context. In this particular study, that is what occurred. The researchers and community members worked together to really identify what was most important to answer in terms of the research. Next slide. Developing the research plan, again, the community, can help decide on the methodology and ensuring that it aligns with their cultural practices and their accessibility, provide insight into logistical considerations, what is going on for that community in terms of being able to participate in research, and can refine and review data collection tools like surveys, interview guides, making sure that questions that are asked are really things that the community will understand the meaning of the question and understand the answers. Next slide. Carrying out the research can be done in partnership between the researcher and the community as well. In community access co-researchers, they can help with data collection, conducting interviews, or administering surveys, offering guidance on culturally appropriate practices for engaging the community, and ensuring that ethical standards are upheld by monitoring the research activities. Next slide. When it comes to interpreting the results, the community can participate in analyzing data, providing context and insights that might not be relevant or evident to researchers, can review preliminary findings, and really making sure that interpretations aligned with the lived experiences of the community members, suggest additional perspectives or factors to consider in the analysis. I have seen the interpretation of results in a CBPR project from qualitative, oral histories, ethnography, focus groups, to quantitative bench science, data analysis of huge surveys being done quite beautifully between community and researchers as a generative process, so that everyone is learning about the results from each other, both from a scientific perspective. Can the answer to this question really mean X? To a deeper understanding level of what a community member might have meant, or a group of community members might have meant if they answered a question in a certain way. Go ahead to the next. And I think one of the most exciting things that we've seen is in the dissemination of results. Remember, I said earlier that traditional research sometimes lives in a journal, academic journal on an academic researcher's shelf. They are not often used for things like policy change or program changes in a community. And the great thing about involving the community in research is the community understands what really can be, how the research was done, and what the answers, what the results of the research mean. Watching community members who have participated in CBPR go to policymakers and talk about a study that isn't just a study that someone told them about, but is a study that they helped create and they helped do, increases the impact and the effectiveness of policy advocacy, because they own that data. They are so committed to the data, to the results of the study, that they're able to really articulate why it's impactful and why policymakers and program people should pay attention. The community also helps to co-create other findings. So from community presentations to policy briefs and academic articles. Don't forget the community partner when you're doing academic articles. They can identify the best channels for reaching key audiences. So is that a local event, social media, newsletters? And as I said, they advocate for action in a way that is really spectacular. Next slide. I'm going to talk about an example, a couple of examples of community-based participatory research. This one study, which I think is really quite appropriate for the work that we're all going to be doing together. This was a research project that was funded between Asian Health Services and a researcher at the Northern California Cancer Center. In the environmental movement, there has been quite a deep concern about what happens to nail salon workers. If you've ever been in a nail salon that doesn't have good outdoor air, you can kind of feel the toxic load, in you. And, there was a lot of discussion about, like, does that affect the person who goes and gets their nails done? The amount of environmental exposure that individual is getting once every 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, is probably pretty low. But the concern really is about the workers who are there every day, every hour, every day, 5, 6, 7 days a week. The challenges with a population that is really marginalized and has fears about law enforcement, frankly, whether you're a documented immigrant or an undocumented immigrant, you have real concerns about what research you participate in, and who you tell your story to. And so this project really had to work very closely with nail salon workers to figure out what is the best way to approach them to start getting information about how these workers were managing. The other complicated nature to this was the nail salon owners, who were also predominantly from the Vietnamese community. They certainly didn't want researchers coming in and saying, you're killing your workers. So making this a CBPR project really allowed the nail salon workers, the nail salon owners, and the researchers to work together to figure out how can we do these studies, do this research to look at what the occupational exposures are in a way that won't harm the nail salon owners, won't harm the nail salon workers, or make them feel that they're a threat to disclose their personal information. These studies took over a decade, starting with very small studies, more like oral history kind of studies, really talking with folks, getting their stories. Then as trust was built, being able to get more detailed information, especially around toxics. Next slide, sorry, which is also the next study. And I love this study. This is a farming organization in Berkeley that works with UC Berkeley to create research on farming practices. And they've really shifted the paradigm around research. They're a community organization that believes that everyone is a researcher, and they prioritize community-driven research agendas. So that's when CBPR has like made its real entrance into the world, is when the community takes over the research agenda, and uses the researchers kind of as consultants to be able to get answers to the questions that they have. Next slide. So some of the key lessons that have been learned about CBPR with marginalized communities. Number one, cultural competence. You have to tailor your approaches to respect the cultural, linguistic, and social norms of the community that you're doing research with. Shared leadership. Involve community members at all stages of the research project. I worked with a group that was interviewing 100 people, and they were so proud that they had 99 people stay as part of the research for 5 years of their study. And when I talked to the community leaders in the research in the CBPR, I was like, 99 out of 100 people stayed 5 years. Like, that is incredible. And they said, well, actually 100 people stayed, but we thought if we listed that no one would believe the study. So we dropped one person from our report. But it is what happens when community leaders are involved in research, is that they signal to the community, like, we're part of this, for leadership, you're not going to be harmed. Capacity building, empowering communities by equipping them with the knowledge and resources to sustain their own change, like what happened with the farm in Berkeley. They did enough CBPR, they learned how to do research, they took over their own research agenda. And then advocacy, using findings to drive policy changes and resource allocation, especially to benefit marginalized groups. Frankly, none of us want to participate in a survey where we don't know that it's had impact. And when you participate in research and we use that data, we went to Sacramento, we made our case, we got new policies. It makes everybody who was a part of that project, including the community members who participated, it makes everybody feel really good about their participation and empowered, and they feel like they can be part of the change, which is an important element. The next presenters are actually going to really drill down into the cultural sensitivity and cultural aspects of this current research project, but hopefully this overview of CBPR is helpful and has you thinking in the right light about what we're trying to do. Khalil?
Yes, thank you, Marge. You made a number of very important points that we will build on. As before I dive in, everyone, my name is Khalil Ferguson. I am the president of United Core Alliance. This is a 501c3 legal aid organization based in Sacramento, California. And I will be going over, as mentioned on the screen, the cultural sensitivity in research, especially as it applies to the CBPR model that Marge so eloquently has introduced to us. And as she mentioned, I will touch on really briefly, we don't have enough time, an aspect of cultural competency that really underscores the importance of this type of model when doing research on communities that will be engaging in. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I don't want to read off the screen, but it's there for everyone to really read along and understand the importance of cultural sensitivity and cultural competency and CBPR methodology and research similar to this. It is pretty important to say that, becoming culturally competent requires a level of vulnerability. But we're not here to define cultural competency, and not here to adopt a theory of what cultural competency is. We're not here to force anyone to abide by what we believe is cultural competency, because that is not the purpose of this study. It's really to demonstrate how one becomes culturally competent and how that is incorporated to research when dealing with people, as opposed to treating them as test subjects. But there are a number of definitions for cultural competence in academia, and we'll go over 3. The first one from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services defines cultural competence as a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in the system, agency, or among professionals and enable that system, agency, or those professions to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. And as I will touch on briefly next, and my partner Hannah Nelson will touch on, there are many identities that come together in the cannabis industry and then for the purposes of this research. But we'll touch on that later. The next definition from the American Association for Health Education defines cultural humility not by a discrete endpoint, but as a commitment and active engagement in a lifelong process that individuals enter into on an ongoing basis with patients, communities, colleagues, and with themselves. A process that requires humility in how physicians bring into check the power imbalances that exist in the dynamics of physician-patient communication by using patient-oriented, patient-focused interviewing and care. And while that doesn't directly apply here, this is also taken from an excerpt of our DEI training that we had internally, where we touched on different types of biases, from biases that we find in sciences to biases that we see in the social sciences, and how they're intersecting themes of where biases occur and how they occur. And lastly, the Health Resources and Services Administration defines cultural competency as the ability to provide services to clients that honor different cultural beliefs, interpersonal styles, attitudes, and behaviors, and the use of multicultural staff in the policy development, administration, and provision of those services. Again, it doesn't directly apply here, but we can take from each of these and see how cultural competency, the common denominator of that is treating individuals as human and understanding the differences and incorporating that into our own staff trainings, our own policy perspectives, and almost in our daily lives. Next slide, please. There truly are 5 essential elements that contribute to a system's or institution's or agency's ability to become more culturally competent. They're listed there. The first one is valuing diversity, having the capacity for cultural self-assessment, which is constantly reflecting, as I mentioned earlier, being conscious of the dynamics inherent when cultures interact, having institutionalized cultural knowledge, and having developed adaptations to service delivery, reflecting an understanding of cultural diversity. And these are just checkboxes. These are things that require that reflection and that vulnerability and that openness to be able to understand, the different identities that come to fruition or are present in the room or in the community when engaging in life. And for the purposes of this study, with our test subjects who are, again, are people, we want to focus on that these are people who have their own backgrounds and perspectives and lived identities and experiences that we wish to respect, especially given the nature of this study. Next slide, please. As Hannah will build on after me, she will follow this slide. Generally, these are some stereotypes that are placed on people in the cannabis industry or users of cannabis that just generally have been stereotypes and myths based on the war on drugs rhetoric, the DARE program rhetoric, the reefer madness, the devil's lettuce, all of that stuff that we've heard of placed on users of cannabis. It kind of boils down to this. They're stereotypes. They're not true. They're just misnomers and misunderstandings placed upon individuals based on their perspectives and not truly understanding the identities of those who use them. Common misconceptions or stereotypes of cannabis consumers, growers and producers. I'm sure we've all heard them. That it turns into a lazy stoner. It's a gateway drug to harder drugs. Cannabis users are hippies. They're always high. It's mostly a male, consumed product. Cannabis users are unproductive, and marijuana is for young party goers. Even the term marijuana. So these are just stereotypes that we need to thaw out and focus on. Just for specifically to the cannabis identity, not even other identities that underlie that people retain independent of these stereotypes. But this is just a very brief description, and Hannah can go into in the greater detail of what how marginalized communities often are impacted by these people are benefited from people who understand these cultural sensitivities. And with that being said, I will pass it to Hannah.
Thank you, Khalil. Next slide, please. My name is Hannah Nelson, and I've been a cannabis attorney for 32 years. And prior to that, I was a social worker. I've lived and worked in both urban and rural communities that have been really heavily impacted by cannabis criminalization, both as a lawyer and a social worker. And I've seen firsthand the destruction, the trauma, and the lasting impacts of the war on drugs that generally occurred and also specific to cannabis criminalization. Next slide. So I come at this from a perspective of really having been in the trenches regarding this work, and particularly working with impacted communities. This next slide is a joke, but then it's not a joke, really. I mean, it touches upon the context and the layers of complexity of designing and implementing a research project, not only with so many multidisciplines involved, which is just awesome, but also involving cannabis genetics, where secrecy was not only a way to protect a commercial asset, but it was a necessity for safety and to avoid imprisonment. I think it's really necessary that we keep in the forefront and understand and keep present throughout the research project this context and the context from which this work flows. Next slide, please. The war on drugs not only has its roots in structural and systemic racism, but very significantly subjected millions of people to targeted and discriminatory policing practices, often resulting in detention, arrest, incarceration, criminal records, money and property seizure, and other traumas that have very real and lasting impacts for the person, their families, and their communities. These impacts included disruption or even elimination of access to resources, and negatively impacted the well-being and often the health of all of those affected. In urban areas, stop and frisk, where people were relentlessly targeted and unfortunately still are, and stopped and frisked during the course of going about their normal daily lives in the areas where they lived, they worked, and that they socialized, was endless harassment and really definitely a form of psychological violence. Also in urban areas, the militarization of drug enforcement resulted in nonstop searchlights through overflights. And of course, in rural areas, as many of you know, the militarization of cannabis enforcement resulted in families being held at gunpoint, endless low-flying overflights of helicopters, and often basic human needs such as water being completely cut off. In both rural and urban areas, tactics such as threatening decades in federal prison to try to get people to turn in their friends and family was another terrorizing tactic used. Researchers have long understood it's important to design research projects dealing with keeping in mind vulnerable people as a category, but more recently, the importance of recognizing contextual vulnerability has been appreciated as a more effective method of using when designing and implementing research. The main difference is that categorical approach considers population, so think elderly population, whereas the contextual approach also looks at all of the circumstances that may result in vulnerability and allows for a lot more nuance. I think that if we keep the greater nuances of vulnerable circumstances in mind, it will help make the design and implementation every step of the way of this research project more applicable and effective. Next slide, please. Underpinning all of this context is the issue of trust. If we have a better awareness and understanding, it helps build a basis for trust. So again, understanding the contextual component of what is impacting people and making them vulnerable, not just as a category, it really can help foster a relationship of trust and prevent and otherwise prevent us from drawing out from the experience, and instead help us fully participate and not cave into the fear and the trauma that is relived as we go through this project. Acknowledgement and context also helps support accountability throughout the research project. Next slide. The potential impacts and practical considerations of taking all of this into account, and kind of on the research team there, you see some of the things that I've listed. I'm sure that's not all of it, but if we don't keep these things front in mind, we can inadvertently perpetuate the biases and incorrect assumptions that could prevent implementation tools and methodologies that would be really the most effective, and it could tacitly perpetuate the injustices that have and are effectuated through the criminalization of kind of, it's another layer of re-traumatizing and recriminalizing. If these perceptions aren't accounted for and to a certain extent protected against. With CAB participants and other participants, really overcoming a resistance to participate or withholding ideas and information and misunderstanding and not having a shared meaning, all of those are impacted. And I think that if we keep in front of our minds all of our vulnerable experiences and the context that which each person comes at this from, and all of the differences and nuances that's contained therein, I think that it does a lot to build the trust and allow for greater participation. Some of the practical things that the criminalization and marginalization of people who have been criminalized by cannabis, the lack of documentation. Remember that first slide was kind of a joke, but the reality is that everybody was told, and I have to tell you, I was, as an attorney, as a criminal defense attorney, was one of the people who told you, don't keep a darn record, don't do anything. Now that's coming back to roost in an entirely different way. It's so beautiful that we could turn this around and embrace this research project and finally bring forward the stewardship of the plants and of the genetics that people have risked life and limb to carry forward. But there's some of these practical considerations to keep in mind. And rather than just saying, oh, this is a problem, we just need to work through the solutions. Also, not wanting to disclose certain things, missing metric information for inconsistencies, whatever. Legal jeopardy. I really think that it's going to be, everything is going to be fine in terms of avoiding any kinds of legal jeopardy for things that have once happened, but it's certainly a concern and something to be aware of. Next slide, please. So bringing this all together, and this is just like each of us have been presenting a mini version of fuller discussions, which are posted on our website, and you can look at full webinars on each issue. But the awareness of diverse experiences really leads to better outreach, participation, and data outcomes. Exploring the nuances rather than trying to avoid them or just categorize everything as a full category really can uncover blind spots and experiences, and integrating and assessing at each step of the way with that understanding of nuance really can make the whole thing not only more effective, but more practical and accurate and useful, which is one of the goals. And finally, in a small way, but an important way, making sure that those truths are recognized does help take a step forward in addressing the societal marginalization through and because of criminalization. If we're speaking this truth and we're carrying it forward and we're not hiding it or ignoring it, then the world, as this research is presented, has to acknowledge that and at least have some small step in addressing some of the marginalization that's happened. And now I'll pass it back to Janine. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm passing it back to Khalil. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you. This next part is something that we adopted in our training, our DEI training internally, and we found it was helpful. We don't have much time, but I would like, if anyone is willing to be vulnerable in this space, I guess we are, building community. But really, no, we'll take 3 people, and if anyone else wants to express themselves, you can do so in the group chat. But really have, not necessarily an epiphany, but really just have express how what we've just said between Marge, myself, and Hannah, anything that you realize that has now come to fruition of your identity, or how you present yourself in the cannabis industry or in the space or in life in general, and how you think that applies to not only your work, but the study. And if folks would like to raise their hand and give a testimony of sorts, I'm happy to select them. Again, we'll only do 3, and anyone else feel free to engage or write that down in the group, in the chat. Kirby, Dr. Lynch.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to come on the line and say great presentation. What's kind of resonating me with the presentation is around trust. Trust is so important in the research process because um Khalil and I have worked on a similar research project, and one barrier I had was building trust with participants for them to really share and feel like it's going somewhere that won't get them in trouble. And I think that's very particular with cannabis in general because of just all of the enforcement and the consequences. So I think with community-based research related to cannabis specifically, as researchers, building trust is something I'm taking very seriously and making sure that it's a win-win for everybody involved.
Thank you for that, Kirby. I see AC Moon Cameron in the queue. Feel free to unmute and come off camera.
Thank you. I'm not sure if my camera is going to work in this space. I am in a farm in Humboldt County, and our video tends to not have a very broad band. So I apologize if my picture doesn't come up. But as a federal raid victim and somebody that has worked in the industry since 1999, I've worked on so many different policy exchanges internationally, from down in the Caribbean to California. And I feel like the grassroots identification of research and embodiment of the compassion that we really went through is like, it's absolutely essential to every single culture that we recognize the amount of mental health disturbance that has been caused by persecution, the PTSD that we all still deal with when choppers go overhead, the raids are still going on. And when we have that cultivation, not just of wanting to capitalize off of free the prisoner and we're getting more media exposure because, 40 tons or whoever put out this prisoner, which is awesome, but it tends to be like a media kind of showing gram of like, oh, look, we're putting this legacy operator on high, when really the true compassion is recognizing that the lack of research, the lack of, like she said, the documentation, all of these things have really compromised our position to be able to even operate in the new business world. And when we walk into these nations and all these different spaces that really don't have the educational backing, and they really want to create these predatory contracts for quote unquote equity members, they are not including the need to have the educational basis behind it, therefore furthering the predatory aspect of it, knowing that they will fail without the information needed to excel further. And I feel like with myself working at the University of Virgin Islands and other spaces, including Oaksterdam University, using our voice and our connective base of not only the grassroots research, our bro science. I'm a female farmer, but quote unquote bro science is now needing to be really like combined with the prohibitive facts that I can't share the pictures that'll prove what we did, because like she said, we were too scared to, get those pictures developed. We didn't have cameras back then. We didn't have these assets that make it so easy to proliferate this information now. So if we bring it all together with compassion, I think that our being able to also adjudicate that information through accredited university bodies and finding, different publications, myself as a journalist, to be able to express that bro science and really have a validated, accredited measure so that we can have a place in the further science of it, then we validate ourselves as not just being stupid stoners. We have been working on a very direct point of contact on how this commerce is going to be integrated into society. So I really appreciate your guys' work. Thanks so much for taking the time to let me have a piece or say in it. And I really appreciate you all. So blessed day.
It's great to hear that, and we need that. And as Todd will mention, that the oral history often overlooks, a lot of our communities and marginalized communities. So the fact that we're even engaging in this oral research and history project in the cannabis industry for folks who otherwise have had to operate in the dark, and it's going to be great. So looking forward to seeing what this produced. So if anyone else would like to reflect, please do so in the group chat or in the chat. We will be moving on. I will pass the stage or the platform back to Janine to move forward with the presentation.
If I could also add,
well, I'm happy
if I could add real quick that on a worldwide note, to the fact that working internationally, projects like this are literally an amazing flagship for world change that we don't even realize. These groups that you guys are creating, if we emulate that in a world platform, we are empowering so many communities that it's insane. So thank you again. And just remember to think in a world perspective, because all of you guys are creating our history.
Thank you, AC. Appreciate it. Well, I just wanted to take a moment here to touch on our culturally sensitive community outreach and engagement plan. And we really want to appreciate the Department of Cannabis Control for actually requiring this component in the research design. And so the way that we've approached that is we've conducted internal trainings that Khalil and Hannah refer to, both in the realm of DEIJ, engaging more on drug impacted community, led an internal team training on CBPR, learning very much as we go. We're going to talk later about the importance of establishing a community advisory board. The website is really key to community and access to the information and to the research team and the work as it unfolds. So please do visit our website frequently. We'll be updating it on a regular basis to include all information about how to engage and work products as they're produced. These webinars and the community meetings that are upcoming are very key to engaging with the community. So we're looking forward to those continuing to unfold. And of course, photo and video documentation throughout the project. And again, these webinars and recordings of our event, our launch event presentation can be found on our website. And with that, I'm happy to, I think, pass it to Todd.
Good afternoon, everybody. So far, we've had a great discussion about what CBPR is and how the research team has taken steps to incorporate culturally sensitivity within the project planning, the project's engagement, as well as the research. Now we want to turn to how CBPR will be further incorporated and applied within the research tracks themselves of the project. And so to kick that off, I'm going to offer just a really truncated and short overview of the research scopes. We have 4 research tracks. The first 3 each contribute to creating a historical and scientific foundation of legacy cannabis genetics in California. Like if we think about, like we're starting almost from scratch, right? And so in many respects, those 3 components are going to combine to create that foundation. The 4th track, which we'll also talk about, is equally significant as it looks at how this foundation, this genetic legacy and heritage can then be harnessed by the communities that have helped steward them. So I'm going to provide this overview very quickly and then pass it to Janine, who's going to discuss the application of CBPR in each of these research tracks. Next slide, please. So this is actually a map of where we're going to focus. The green highlights the counties, the 6 rural regions, the legacy cultivated outdoor regions that we're going to be conducting this research. And so, of course, Humboldt, Trinity, and Mendocino counties, Sonoma counties, and Nevada counties, as well as on the Central Coast, looking at Santa Cruz, Monterey, and San Luis Obispo. We're also going to be researching in urban centers in Northern and Southern California. And so up north, we look from the Bay Area stretching along the I-80 corridor, right? So San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, and Sacramento, as well as then down in Southern California along the coastal or I-5 corridor of looking at Long Beach, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Next slide, please. So the first research track is our ethnographic and political geography research, and this is led by Dr. Dominic Corva at Cal Poly Humboldt. If you happen to missed it, you can get more details on his scope from his webinar presentation from November 21st, and that's currently now on our website. But as Dominic and his team will be mapping, in a sense, creating a political geography of California cannabis genetics, and so this is really focusing on place and the movement of genetics. Next slide. And to do this, Dominic's not only just going to combine archival research as well as other sources, but predominantly with ethnographic interviews. Now, ethnographic interviews are semi-structured interviews about experiences, places, and events, which the interviewees typically remain anonymous. He's going to conduct about 100 of these interviews, and the research collectively is going to largely revolve around three questions. When and where in California were communities formed around the stewardship of cannabis genetics, largely looking at breeding and cultivation? The second is when and where in the world did California plant stewards connect with other places in terms of genetic development and plant stewardship? And then the third question for both of these is looking at what were the social conditions that shaped the choices people made, with a real particular focus on, of course, law enforcement, prohibition, and the war on drugs. Next slide, please. And so, as I said, so ethnographic interviews, the interviewees largely remain anonymous. And so he's going to be putting these together, and he's going to be publishing 2 academic journal articles. The first is going to be placing California cannabis legacy in a world historical context. So that means really connecting the flows of California plants and plant people from other older global legacy plants, people, and places. The second article is then going to be placing California regions in this kind of context of California cannabis legacy. So explaining the diversity of cannabis history and communities within California, largely going from, say, Humboldt to Santa Cruz to San Diego. Next slide, please. So again, the goals of the work for Dominic is looking, again, creating a political geography of California cannabis, right? So we're going to explain the development of California as a modern legacy world historical cannabis place, to situate that history in the context of cannabis eradication and prohibition, and to represent California's modern legacy in a way that also understands, affirms, and respects the legacy of other cannabis places, including their experience of cannabis eradication and prohibition. Next slide. So as Dominic is looking at a political geography and trying to look at place, on this broad view, I'm going to be conducting oral histories that actually dig into each region. And so collecting oral histories and creating a historical record of cannabis in these regions of California. Next slide, please. So what is oral history? Well, oral history is recorded interviews that are a collection of memories and personal commentaries of historical significance through recorded interviews. Now, if we think, just as Hannah was talking about, right? Like a lawyer was always might be telling cannabis communities, hey, do not keep anything, right? Don't keep a record. Well, history is actually written by records. So if we don't have records, how are we going to go and actually write a history of place, events, etc.? And so oral history is a method that for now nearly 70 years or more, historians have used to in a sense, record and document these historical experiences of people and communities that had largely been written out of the historical record through various means. And so so if we think of cannabis, like oral history is really one of the foundational ways we're going to begin to document the history of California cannabis and the experience of these people and communities that are in our regions. And so the role in the project that I'm going to conduct about 100 hours of oral histories. And these oral histories are also not just going to be recorded, but they're going to be transcribed. So these transcripts are going to then be in an archive at UC Berkeley, and they're going to be completely open to researchers and the public. And so it's through this type of documentation, through the transcripts, that we're going to be able to then create a historical record of these communities and their experiences. Next slide, please. And so the goals of the oral history is to create the California Cannabis Oral History Collection at UC Berkeley. This will be a collection that's the first of its kind, and that will be allowing us to actually place California cannabis in the historical record for the first time. More importantly, it is also a history that is told by the community members themselves, that will there be not just to inform future generations and scholars and policymakers, but also the general public. And together, this is going to be used with the other scopes, again, to combine with the ethnographic interviews as well as the science, which we'll talk about in a minute, to again bring this all together for the first time, and as well as provide a resource to communities as they look at recognizing the legacy and heritage of California cultivators through maybe intellectual protection. Next slide, please. All right, now we went from political geography to history, and now we're going to have to go to science, right? And so the herbarium science and plant genetics is going to be led by Dr. Eleanor Kuntz, as well as with her team at Candor and LeafWorks. Eleanor, it should be noted that Candor, as maybe people on this webinar know, is the world's first cannabis herbarium, and LeafWorks is a botanical genetics company. Next slide, please. So the scientific work is going to be largely in, like, I like to think of it in two sectors, right? So the herbarium component is a foundational method to define genetic resources. A herbarium is a collection of preserved plant specimens and associated data used for scientific study. Now, the project plans to voucher 100 plant specimens in each of the 6 rural study areas and up to 100 plant specimens collectively in the urban regions. And the vouchers act as a reference of the plants, and that will be linked to descriptive data such as the cultivar that's in the voucher, the growing environments, cultivation techniques and methods. And the vouchers will be held as a community resource as a special collection within the Candor Herbarium, which again, this is the first cannabis herbarium in the world. Next slide, please. In addition to the herbarium work, Eleanor and her team, the genetic sequence will be conducting genetic sequencing, which builds again on this herbarium work, pursuing a comparative analysis of the genetic diversity between a legacy farming region with a significant number of licensed farms and a legacy farming region that has to date not yet had really a path to licensure. And this study will provide a better understanding of the effects of California legalization and regulation on legacy plant diversity and persistence, and how access to licensure and market dynamics has affected this diversity. Now, to do this, there's planned to a minimum of 100 cannabis plants that have been submitted to the herbarium will be deep sequenced. And this is going to be sampling plants from a licensed community, maybe such as Humboldt, with half the submissions looking at licensed legacy operators and the other half really looking at unlicensed, like personal medical legacy cultivators. And then we're also going to have a sampling of plants from an unlicensed region, such as like the Big Sur community. Additionally, approximately 6 what we would think of collectors, individuals with diverse and historic collections of seeds and plants, who are representative of both rural and urban communities, will be donated a minimum of 10 plant lineages each for this sequencing component. Lastly, in each of the 6 rural regions, 2 cultivars of significant importance will be selected for what we call a cultivar registration with LeafWorks. And a cultivar registration is a document linking herbarium vouchers with formal botanical descriptions and genetic sequencing data that can then be used to verify a given plant material as that specified defined cultivar, and thereby supporting commercial licensing and IP protection. Next slide, please. So the goal of this work, on the scientific front is really, again, not just to create that foundation, but to document the legacy California cannabis plant diversity. So we're going to understand the history of the plants and document through the herbarium creation and plant vouchering that type of legacy. We're going to codify names of established cultivar strain varietals, and in doing so, document their phenotypic boundaries, as well as the breeding history, meaning largely looking at the evolutionary kind of lineage of those plants. And therefore also understand how cannabis genetic diversity is distributed both within communities and between regions. Next slide, please. All right. Lastly, our 4th research track is looking at public policy and IP protection. Again, just like the ethnographic interviews, oral histories, and herbarium and genetic work, these provide like important contributions of their own, but also collectively create that kind of scientific and historical foundation of California cannabis. The IP work really looks to also create a foundation of which we could communities can then begin to discover and look of what options are there to harness those resources. Next slide, please. So the IP and policy component of the research examines existing, but also possible future IP and public policy instruments that could support cultivators and breeders in stewarding genetic diversity, protecting some novel genetics, and commercially leveraging the collective and individual genetic resources. Research will inform content of a public educational webinar, as well as a report about IP protections and commercialization of genetic resources, such as licensing agreements and appellation development. The goal here is that the research team will also analyze the impacts of existing and potential policy frameworks on genetic diversity and the market opportunities for commercial cannabis cultivation and breeding. Next slide, please. So the goals of this work is really the development of an educational presentation and materials available to the public via our website through webinars and community meetings. These presentations and materials are intended to support the cultivation community in understanding how to document, protect as intellectual property, and commercially leverage their individual and collective genetic resources. The research and analysis will also inform a suite of public policy recommendations to support advocates and policymakers in developing policy that supports the agricultural futures of historic cannabis cultivation communities. Next slide. So now I'm gonna hand it over to Janine.
All right, I'm excited to talk about the application of CBPR in our project. Next slide, please. So first, I wanted to share with you the community participation in our project to date. So representing my community-based organization, Origins Council, and just to touch on the organization briefly, we serve California's historic rural cannabis cultivation regions. And I had the pleasure of reaching out and assembling our research team based on existing working relationship with all of these amazing folks in response to the DCC call for proposals. And we worked to collaboratively develop the community-based participatory research proposal for a grant application. Then we were really excited to onboard United Core Alliance and Khalil to serve as our second community-based organization. And just to touch briefly on UCA, again, UCA is a statewide equity advocacy voice that represents the interests of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in urban populations, working to increase their inclusion in the cannabis industry across the state. So with the support of UCA, we're able to expand the study to include the historic urban and BIPOC cannabis cultivation communities in order to pursue this really comprehensive statewide study. So currently, Origins Council and United Core Alliance are collaborating with regional community groups active with the cannabis community across California to recruit participants for a focus group. And that focus group will help to inform the criteria for membership in our community advisory board. And we're gonna get into more detail about the CAB in a little bit here. Next slide, please. So moving forward, the community participation in the project includes establishing the community advisory board, and that's going to include members from the legacy cultivation communities with expertise relevant to legacy genetics. The CAB will collaborate with project personnel to develop criteria, identify and recruit research participants. So that's a very core place for the community participation to come in. The CAB will offer input on the selection of a community-based organization within one of the research regions to mentor in establishing a local herbarium of their regional voucher specimens. I'm particularly excited about that moving forward. Origins Council, United Core Alliance, and the CAB will provide input in the CBPR program evaluation. And that evaluation will help to develop the CBPR model, which is one of the objectives and outputs of the research project, is to really try and create a model for communities that are legally marginalized to pursue community-based participatory research around cannabis. Can you go back briefly? So researchers will support community members in selecting 2 cultivars of significant importance for cultivar registration with LeafWorks. So that's another community-driven decision point in the research project. And lastly here, community members will help in selecting which subject should be a part of the oral history in connection to plants that are vouchered for the study regions. And this is really critical to really tie the community and cultural history to the specific cultivars that we're studying, and kind of get to those origin pieces. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk broadly about community advisory boards and their role in the context of CBPR. In community-based participatory research, a community advisory board, which I've been referring to as a CAB, is a group of community members who provide leadership and structure to guide the partnership's activities. CABs are often made up of volunteers who share a common interest, identity, geography, history, language, or culture. Our CAB intends to be pretty diverse because cannabis is a very diverse culture, really, and community. CABs can serve as a link between the community and researchers and can help to ensure that research strategies respect the values and cultural differences of participants. CABs can also help to formalize academic community partnerships by providing a way for the community members to be represented in research activities. Next slide, please. So the Community Advisory Board's scope of work in this project includes helping to socialize and promote the project, to collaborate with project personnel and help inform the ongoing development of the culturally sensitive community outreach, education, and engagement plan, and support implementation, to advise project personnel on the design and implementation of community relations campaigns. So all things community engagement, including educational programming, community meetings, public events, and field work. Collaborate with project personnel to develop the criteria, identify and recruit research participants. Again, want to emphasize this piece. And to collaborate with project personnel to support research, analysis, and community engagement regarding the overall botanical, legal, and public policy scopes. And again, to inform our program evaluation. Next slide, please. So what is the time commitment and is there compensation for CAB members? So selected members will commit to serve on the CAB for the duration of the project through July 2026. And we're anticipating to form our CAB in January of this coming year in 2025. And right now we're proposing to structure meetings via Zoom for convenience of everyone and to hold those Zoom meetings 1 to 2 times monthly with the research team. We do have the opportunity to compensate CAB members through an honorarium. And so participating CAB members will receive a minimum of a $5,000 honorarium per year of their service. Next slide, please. So what is the criteria for the CAB and the application selection process look like? So first, our foundational criteria for the CAB is that we're seating a 13-member CAB comprised of the legacy producing community. And we want to include representation from rural, urban, and BIPOC communities. And we want to onboard folks with exceptional knowledge, experience, and expertise relevant to legacy genetics. Again, Origins Council and United Core Alliance are collaborating with regional community groups across California to recruit participants for a focus group. And that focus group will help inform the criteria for CAB membership, building upon that foundational criteria I just mentioned. And we'll be featuring community groups and the focus group participants on our website, as well as our CAB members once those are seated. So who selects CAB members? CAB members will be selected by the research team. And again, we're going to base our selections on the criteria established by the focus group with input received also in this webinar. And so we'll be getting to that interactive piece here in a moment. How do people apply to serve on the CAB? The research team is planning to open up a nomination process via our website in early 2025. However, if you're interested now, please feel free to email us at info@legacygenetics.org. Next slide, please. Great. So we wanted to open up here shortly for attendee input from all of you regarding the Community Advisory Board criteria. So again, we've got our baseline criteria, 13 members from the legacy producing community. We want to ensure there's representation from rural, urban, and BIPOC communities, particularly in the study regions. And we want folks with exceptional knowledge, experience, and expertise relevant to legacy genetics. So we'd like to invite you all to offer input into criteria for our Community Advisory Board. We ask that you please don't put forward names of specific folks. Instead, let's focus on criteria categories and specifics. So here's some examples. In looking at demographic criteria, we can think about things like geographical location and specific communities, racial diversity, age spectrum, gender spectrum. In looking at knowledge and experiential factors, these are just a couple of examples. I want to be really clear that we haven't set any criteria beyond what's the baseline criteria above, but just as an example, one idea is a minimum of 20 years experience as a cultivator in California. Another concept is a breeder with a minimum of 10 years of established cultivars currently in the market. So those are just some ideas to get us going. And so with that, we'd love to open it up to input from all of you. Feel free to use the chat and also use the raise hand function. And if you can't find that, just let us know and we'll get a queue going and start the dialogue. And thank you, AC. I see your suggestion here. I appreciate it. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. I know I always got something to say. Sorry about that. So I really feel that like, as you said, that 20-year minimum experience is really that legacy portion, because that you got to have that history and that interaction with at some point. I also feel like the second generation farmers have their own demographic as including some of the millennials that may at this point be third generation, like my son, or people that around my age in their mid 40s already have cultivating children. There's several different perspectives that I think that we can collect, because there's so many different demographics. Like if somebody has a business in media for 20 years, they may have different information than somebody that was in cultivation 20 years ago, or somebody that had, you know, like myself or Jeff Jones had a compassionate care center or a dispensary, which was a cooperative at time, really have a different insight into social judgment than somebody that only entered, you know, 6 years ago, bought into the new recreational platform, even if they were just hustling in the back end. But hustling, I think, might have something to do with it too. I mean, adding into the fact that those that have been under persecution at some point in time, they have yet another real diverse history that I think would be very applicable at that point. So that is definitely my take. Also, those cultivar aspects of breeding, I feel that that's very applicable in the specific genetics part. And any information on global policies, the way that what you're doing here, Janine, is going to affect things, I think is also helpful too, because it helps us integrate and target the information that we need to gather, like through community and society for like a global world. And thanks, guys.
Hey, this is Patty Harris. I'm sorry I'm driving
Really appreciate
and
it.
I can't text, but I would really like to put in a word for reaching out to Indian country in the state. And I'm down here in San Diego. We have more Indian tribes and reservations in this county than any other county in the entire country. And there are a lot of people who are active in the cannabis community, but they are not involved in the California market. The native tribes have their own market. We call it the red market. And I really feel like it's an important ethnographic factor and data that can be collected from there. So I just wanted to put that out there for everyone.
Thank you, Patty. Yeah, we really agree. And that was a commitment that Origins Council made with respect to our outreach and engagement as well. And so I look forward to working with you to really connect with the Native community, this group, as well as the Latino community, in particular in the rural communities, because they also have been, you know, I think really key contributors and less in the forefront of the knowledge base that we really appreciate the ideas. Seeing the chat, Bulgarians and also maybe Trimmigrants. And I do want to speak to what you said, AC Moon, about the hustle, right? Those that really moved product historically, I think, have a really amazing knowledge also about the sort of market-driven development of specific cultivars and the diaspora of genetics and cultivars. So I think that's like a really key piece to bring forward. Thank you for touching on that. Great. Other ideas from folks? Don't be shy. And again, you know, feel free to, after the webinar is concluded, compassion side, absolutely crucial. Movement in here in California really took flight with the Back to Lander movement and the compassion movement. Really appreciate flagging that. It's super crucial. Well, I'd like to also invite folks, traditional distribution channels. That's great. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I just wanted to basically speak to, touch on some of what Hannah spoke to, some of what Khalil spoke to, and just kind of, the conversation at hand here. I think it's really important to share, right? Encourage the community to get involved, encourage those that you guys are referencing, those leaders in your community, the indigenous leadership, the Latino leadership, the Black leadership, the legacy, mountain back to the lander leadership, to participate and to reach out and to be in touch. We're a great team, a very diverse team, but we definitely really want to encourage the community engagement, and that's obviously my role. But I want to really encourage everyone to engage your own community, bring the community together, encourage them to monitor the website, sign up for the updates. Because it really does come down to that web, that network. And I mean, as I was discussing the other day, with Dominic Corva on the side of the ethnographic and political geography of it, it's like there's so many diverse communities. We're talking like, Grateful Dead heads, Back to the Landers, you know what I mean? All these movements that happened, these seed exchanges that happened before cannabis was ever even remotely commercialized. It was a kind of backyard trade and a hippie hustle, as we'll call it, right? So it's just, there's such a cool, it's like a lot of it, really even came in probably jazz blues era, all this, it's like there's so many components here to consider. So just bringing that perspective, I just wanted to have that top of mind for folks as you're in your community engaging. And that's really what it comes down to. This is why it's CBPR, is because it's really all about y'all helping to form the cab and to, really direct and assist in the direction of the study.
Thanks, Sam. Really appreciate everything that you bring. It's just such a pleasure to work with you both. Well, we're nearing the end here. So I'd love to invite closing comments from folks. And before we go, I'm going to screen share my screen again to make sure that everyone is keyed into the next webinar coming up. But before we go there, I'm happy to invite some closing comments from folks.
I'll just add just thanks to everybody for joining, for participating, and this lives on beyond this study. As Janine spoke about, one of the goals of this work is to actually lay out how CBPR can be done well in this field with this community, and will be that'll be one of the outcomes of this work. So it's very excited as a CBPR person. It's very exciting to be a part of this and to see how we can create a model. So thank you all.
Great. Well, thank you all. We really, really appreciated the dialogue that we had today. And we want to make sure to let everyone know about our upcoming webinar regarding oral history. So please join us in a couple of weeks on December 20th from 12 to 1 p.m. Dr. Holmes will talk about the 100 hours of oral history interviews to be conducted in the study and their use and role in the research. And we'll have participant Q&A in that webinar as well. Pre-registration is required, so please go to our website to register and join our mailing list, and you can find us at legacygenetics.org. Thank you all so much.